Hello there. I hope you're doing great. Today I would like to take you on a chilling adventure that takes place somewhere on the road to Banff. When you're ready, buckle up and let's go. Richard stepped out of the car, the crisp evening air biting at his skin. He grabbed his phone, holding it high in search of a signal. The screen remained blank. Figures, he muttered, shoving the useless device into his pocket. Ahead, a faint dirt path branched off from the road, disappearing into the forest. He hesitated, glancing back at his car. The empty highway stretched behind him, offering no signs of help. With a sigh, he grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and started toward the path. The trail wound its way into the trees, barely wide enough for a single person. Richard picked his way carefully, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the encroaching darkness. The forest felt alive, its shadows shifting and twisting as if watching his every step. The air grew colder as he moved deeper into the woods, each breath forming small clouds in front of his face. A thin mist curled around his ankles, clinging to him like ghostly tendrils. "Hello," he called out, his voice startlingly loud in the silence. Only the faint rustle of leaves answered him. He pressed on, the unease in his chest growing heavier with every step. The forest around him seemed wrong. The trees were too close together, their trunks warped and twisted. Strange markings appeared on the bark. Spirals, jagged shapes, and what looked like handprints smeared in dark, dried stains. Richard paused, shining his flashlight over one of the symbols. The lines seemed to shimmer faintly under the light, as if alive. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, stepping back. A sharp crack sounded behind him. He whipped around, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam illuminated nothing but the dense underbrush. "Just a deer," he told himself, though the words felt hollow. Yet another sound, this one louder, a low growl, deep and resonant. It came from somewhere ahead, echoing through the trees. "Is someone there?" he called, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. The growl came again, closer this time. He took a step back, his flashlight darting nervously across the trees. That's when he saw it. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the path. The figure emerged slowly from the shadows, its pale, skeletal frame bathed in the sickly glow of Richard's flashlight. It stood at the edge of the trail, unmoving but somehow brimming with menace. Richard's breath hitched. He tried to call out, but the words caught in his throat. The creature was impossibly thin, its elongated limbs draped with sagging, leathery skin. Its head was grotesque, half human, half beast, with empty, glowing eyes that seemed to pierce straight into his soul. Antlers jutted from its skull-like head, their jagged points dripping with something dark and viscous. A guttural clicking noise escaped its throat, a sound so unnatural that it made Richard's skin crawl. It tilted its head almost curiously and took a single, deliberate step forward. "Stay back!" Richard croaked, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The creature's mouth opened slowly, revealing rows of jagged, blood-stained teeth. A low, rumbling growl emanated from deep within its chest, growing louder and more feral with each passing second. Then, without warning, the light flickered. For a brief moment, the trail plunged into darkness. When the beam returned, the creature was gone. Richard stumbled backward, his heart pounding. He whipped the flashlight around, scanning the trees, but the figure had vanished. The oppressive silence of the forest returned, but now it felt heavier, charged with unseen malice. He took a shaky breath and turned back toward the path, determined to keep moving. But before he could take a step, a cold wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a sound that froze him in place. A woman's voice. It was faint and distant, like the whisper of wind through leaves, but unmistakable. "Help me." Richard's blood ran cold. The voice was filled with pain, desperation, and something else. Something he couldn't quite place. He shone the flashlight in the direction of the sound, his legs trembling. "Hello? Is someone there?" The forest answered with silence. Then the voice came again, this time closer. "Please, help me." It was followed by another sound, a soft, wet noise, like the tearing of flesh. Richard's stomach churned. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move. Slowly he stepped off the path, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand as he pushed through the dense undergrowth. The voice led him deeper into the forest, its tone shifting with every word. It became colder, more distorted until it no longer sounded human at all. Finally, the beam of his flashlight landed on something that made his blood freeze. A figure crouched low to the ground, its back to him. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its fingers ending in sharp, talon-like claws. A thick mane of tangled hair covered its head, and its skin was mottled with dark, oozing sores. Richard stepped back, a branch snapping under his foot. The creature's head snapped around, revealing a face that was part human, part animal. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth hung open, dripping with blood. A Wendigo, his mind screamed. But before he could react, the shadows around him seemed to come alive. From the corner of his eye, he caught movement. He turned the flashlight to his right, only to see another figure dart behind a tree. It was fast, too fast for him to make out any details, but its outline was eerily similar to the first creature. Panic set in. Richard spun in a circle, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Everywhere he looked, he saw shapes moving in the darkness, slender, shadowy figures with glowing eyes that watched him from the trees. The wind picked up, carrying a cacophony of sounds that made his skin crawl. Guttural growls, clicking noises, and the faint, mocking laughter of unseen entities. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if it were shifting. He looked down and gasped. The earth was littered with bones, animal and human, their surfaces gnawed clean. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the forest, so low and guttural that it felt like it was coming from the ground itself. "You do not belong here." Richard's flashlight flickered again, the beam growing dimmer. He tried to move, but his legs felt like lead. The growling grew louder, and the shadows around him seemed to close in. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure unlike any he'd seen before. It was massive, its body covered in thick, matted fur that glistened with moisture. Its face was a grotesque blend of man and wolf, with glowing red eyes that burned with rage. A Sasquatch, but twisted and feral. It stared at him for a long moment before letting out a deafening roar that shook the very trees. Richard turned and ran. His feet pounded against the uneven ground as he fled back toward the trail. Branches tore at his clothes and the cold wind burned his lungs, but he didn't dare stop. The growling and laughter followed him, growing louder with every step. He could feel eyes on him, watching, tracking, waiting for him to falter. Then came the whispers. Dozens of voices, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. They were soft at first, but they quickly grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic cacophony that made his head throb. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. Richard stumbled, his hands grasping blindly at the air as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. He fell to his knees, clutching his head as the voices seemed to burrow into his mind. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. He opened his eyes and found himself surrounded. The creatures were everywhere, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. Wendigos, skinwalkers, Sasquatches, and things he couldn't even name. They stood silently, their forms shifting and melting into the shadows. At their center was the first creature he'd seen, the gaunt figure with antlers. It stepped forward, its hollow eyes fixed on him. "You should not have come here," it said, its voice low and echoing. The shadows closed in, and Richard's screams were swallowed by the forest. Richard jolted awake with a gasp. He was lying on the forest floor, surrounded by a circle of smoldering black ash. His clothes were torn, his hands scratched and bloodied. The flashlight lay broken beside him, its shattered glass catching the faint moonlight. The forest was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of burnt wood and something metallic, blood perhaps. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. "What happened?" he whispered. His voice sounded foreign, hollow, as though it didn't belong to him anymore. His last memories were fragmented, a blur of glowing eyes, twisted shadows, and a deafening cacophony of inhuman voices. But something gnawed at the edges of his mind, something he couldn't quite grasp. The forest around him had changed. The trees were taller, their branches curling unnaturally toward the ground like clawed hands. The ground beneath his feet felt spongy, as if he were standing on decayed flesh rather than soil. Richard staggered forward, desperate to find the trail. But the forest seemed endless, stretching in every direction without offering a single familiar landmark. That's when he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. He froze, his heart pounding. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in his chest. Slowly, he turned toward the noise. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing. It was human in shape but wrong in every conceivable way. Its skin was a patchwork of decay, mottled with blackened veins that pulsed like living things. Antlers jutted from its head, dripping with ichor, and its eyes burned with an unnatural light. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures emerged from the darkness. Skinwalkers with ever-shifting forms, their faces melting and reforming with every step. Hulking, misshapen Sasquatches with jagged claws and eyes that glowed like embers. And towering above them all was a figure made entirely of shadows, its featureless form flickering like a dying flame. Richard stumbled backward, his breath hitching. "This isn't real," he whispered. The antlered figure stepped forward, its voice a low, echoing rasp. "Reality is not what you think it is, Richard." The words sent a chill through his body. "How do you know my name?" The creature tilted its head. "You have always belonged to us." The words twisted in Richard's mind, pulling at memories he didn't recognize as his own. He stumbled backward, his vision blurring. The forest around him shifted, the trees melting into towering spires of black stone. The sky above turned a deep, unnatural red, streaked with veins of pulsing light. The creatures encircled him, their glowing eyes fixed on him with an almost predatory hunger. "No," he stammered. "This isn't happening. I need to get back to the road, to the wedding." The antlered figure laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The road? There is no road, Richard. There never was." Pain shot through his head, sharp and blinding. Memories flooded his mind, his car breaking down, the dark forest, the wedding invitation clutched in his hand. But something was wrong, the invitation. He could see it clearly in his mind now, the ornate script, the address, the date. But it was blank. No names, no details. Just empty, meaningless paper. "What's happening to me?" he cried, clutching his head. The creatures around him began to chant, their voices low and guttural. The ground beneath him cracked, releasing plumes of black smoke that carried faint, distorted screams. "Do you remember now?" the antlered figure asked, stepping closer. Its glowing eyes bored into him, peeling away the layers of his mind. And then he saw it. The crash. Flashes of twisted metal and shattered glass filled his mind. The sound of screeching tires, the violent impact, the sickening crunch of bone. He hadn't broken down on the road to Banff. He had died there. The creatures encircling him weren't monsters. They were his memories, his guilt, and his fears, given form in this liminal space between life and death. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real. This can't be real." "It is as real as you are," the antlered figure said. Richard fell to his knees, his mind reeling. He had been driving too fast, distracted by his phone. He had been the cause of the crash. He had killed not just himself, but the occupants of another car, a family heading home from a weekend trip. The shadows shifted, and the figures around him changed. No longer monstrous, they became human. A woman with a kind face, a man clutching a teddy bear, and a little girl with wide, frightened eyes. The little girl stepped forward, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Why didn't you stop?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry," Richard whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean to. I didn't see you." The shadows closed in, their voices growing louder, more accusatory. The pain in Richard's chest became unbearable, as though his very soul were being torn apart. Richard's screams echoed through the forest as the creatures descended on him. When the pain subsided, he found himself standing on the road. His car was there, intact, the headlights cutting through the mist. The forest was silent, the air still. He stumbled toward the car, his hands trembling. When he climbed inside and turned the key, the engine roared to life. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. As he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw them. The woman, the man, and the little girl, their faces pale and lifeless, staring at him from the back seat. "You can't escape us," the girl whispered. The engine died, and the world plunged into darkness. In the distance, the antlered figure watched, its glowing eyes unblinking, and then silence. Richard opened his eyes again. He was back on the road, his car idling beneath a dark, starless sky. The forest loomed on either side, its twisted trees seeming to lean toward him. The eerie silence pressed against his ears, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. His breath came in shallow gasps, but something compelled him to drive. The headlights cut through the endless darkness as he pressed the accelerator, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and the horrors he'd faced. The road stretched on, straight and featureless, flanked by the oppressive wall of trees. He checked the dashboard. The gas gauge was full, though he distinctly remembered it being near empty earlier. The clock on the dashboard flickered, stuck at 3:33. Then he saw it. A figure in the distance, standing in the middle of the road. It was small, no larger than a child. His foot instinctively moved to the brake, but the car didn't slow. The headlights illuminated the figure as he approached. A little girl, her pale face framed by limp, dark hair, her wide eyes staring directly at him. He screamed and jerked the wheel, veering off the road. The car didn't crash. It didn't even shudder. Instead, it glided seamlessly back onto the same stretch of asphalt. The little girl was gone, but ahead, he saw something that made his stomach drop. The same figure stood in the road once more, identical in every way. No, he whispered, his voice cracking. This can't be happening. He swerved again, harder this time, and again found himself back on the same road. The girl appeared once more, her face expressionless but her eyes unrelenting. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't driving away from anything. He was driving in circles, or worse, trapped in a loop that wasn't his own. The radio crackled to life, though he hadn't touched it. Static filled the cabin, followed by a voice, distorted and otherworldly. You cannot run from your guilt, Richard. You cannot run from us. The dashboard lights flickered. The rearview mirror showed the same three figures from before, the woman, the man, and the little girl, all staring at him with hollow eyes. Richard slammed his foot on the brake, but the car didn't stop. It sped up, the engine roaring as if possessed. The headlights illuminated the forest ahead, but now it was no longer trees that flanked the road. The shadows twisted into grotesque, towering shapes, figures with antlers, glowing eyes, and mouths filled with too many teeth. They watched him, silently judging, as the car hurtled down the endless road. And then he saw it. The figure standing in the road wasn't a little girl anymore. It was himself, pale, lifeless, and staring back at him with a twisted smile. The car collided with the figure, and everything went black. When Richard opened his eyes again, he was standing in the forest. His car was gone. The road was gone. The only sound was the wind whispering through the trees. In his hand was a wedding invitation, the paper blank except for two words scrawled in blood-red ink. Welcome home. Above him, the antlered figure loomed, its glowing eyes unblinking. This time, there was no escape. Thank you for coming on this adventure with me. If you made it this far, then try to guess the spooky riddle you'll find in the comments, and also leave a ghost emoji down below. If you enjoyed this journey, then you know the drill. Like, subscribe, and check out also other scary stories in this channel. Take care, and see you in our next journey.